Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another CEN seminar. So today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome not just one, but two fantastic speakers who are going to do a tag team effort to tell us about their work on interventions to reduce the spread and the influence of misinformation, including some of the challenges inherent in these interventions and ways that we can try and overcome some of these. So we're going to start with John. John Roozenbeek is a lecturer in psychology and security at King's College London's Department of War Studies. His research focuses broadly on misinformation, authoritarianism, and intergroup conflict, particularly the ongoing war in Ukraine. And he has recently published not one, but two books with Cambridge University Press. One is called The Psychology of Misinformation, and the other is called Propaganda and Ideology in the Russian-Ukrainian War. We will then move on to Rakoen. So Rakoen Maertens is the J.C. Matthews Junior Research Fellow at the University of Oxford, New College, and the co-chair of the United Nations Committee of the Society for Personality and Social Psychology. His work focuses on the application of psychological science to fight misinformation, the measurement of misinformation susceptibility, and the evaluation of the long-term effectiveness of interventions to reduce misinformation susceptibility. So this is obviously an extremely relevant topic given current events, and I will now hand over to John and Rakoen to hear more about their work.
Thank you very much, Astrid. Rakoen and I have agreed that I will go first, and the idea behind the talk is that I will set up the problem and Rakoen will propose the solution. So I hope you'll enjoy that. In the meantime, while I'm talking, at least this goes for me, I can't speak for Rakoen, of course. I'm happy to answer some questions if they are sort of relatively minor and can be answered fairly quickly while I'm talking. But if you have sort of bigger questions like what's the meaning of life or something like that, then it's probably better left for the end of the talk, if that's okay. I'll start by sharing my screen. Here we go. Is this visible? Does this work? Rakoen, could you please confirm so that yeah, okay, great. Wonderful.
Good.
So to give you a little bit of background, Rakoen and I started working together, and I think it was 2018. Please correct me if I'm wrong about that, Rakoen. When Rakoen joined the lab that I was working at the time in the University of Cambridge, first as a research assistant, then lab manager, then PhD student, and then postdoc. And so during that time, we worked a lot on the development and testing of interventions that counter misinformation. Some of those include games, some of those include sort of short videos, most of which are based on this idea of psychological inoculation or psychological vaccines against misinformation, which Rakoen will explain more about in detail. But this field really exploded in 2016. You might take a guess as to why that was the case at the time, when a lot of researchers, including psychologists, but also political scientists, sociologists, and others, started working to find ways to counter either the belief in or the spread of misinformation. And broadly speaking, there has been a distinction that has been made over the years between individual level interventions and system level interventions. And so with respect to system level interventions, you could think of things like changing how algorithms work that recommend people content on social media, addressing the business models, right, that tech companies and social media companies use to make a profit. Today, I believe this is today, the Australian government banned social media for under 16s, which is definitely a system level intervention, right? Very all-encompassing, you might say, more of a mallet than a scalpel, I suppose. But that's one way of countering, you know, misinformation to a degree, although that is not the only reason why they passed that law. Anyway, those are interventions that, generally speaking, have a very big effect size, meaning they work very well at countering misinformation, but they also have big downsides, right? For example, it's much easier in this way to infringe on freedom of speech. You're centralizing the responsibility for what kind of content is shown to people and what kind of content is not shown to people, usually with like a relatively few decision makers at tech companies, which is complicated, a very difficult discussion to have. And then on the other hand, we have individual level interventions, which have been divided up into 4 different categories. One is debunking, so we can fact check misinformation, right? We can correct misinformation when people see it or when people spread it. We also have automated fact checking, which is becoming more and more popular now with the rise of AI, and so on. We have labeling, so content can be labeled as being reliable, unreliable, true or false. Sources can be labeled as having a higher or lower degree of reliability or trustworthiness, etc. Then we have boosting, which is basically fostering certain competences or teaching people new skills to identify potentially misleading content or misinformation, which includes pre-bunking, which Rakoen will talk about more, digital literacy, etc. And then finally, we have nudges, which are basically changes that we make in people's environments. So, for example, social media, to reduce the sharing of misinformation with other people. So those are roughly the types of solutions that we have available. And in this review paper that I wrote together with 2 of my colleagues, Miriam Remshart and Yara Kirichenko, we kind of surveyed this field to see what has worked, what has not worked. And broadly speaking, we find that there's quite a lot that works pretty well, but we also identify a couple of challenges in the implementation of these interventions, for example, on people's social media feeds or as part of educational programs, and so on and so on. And they are these 6. First, what we lack tremendously in this field is good field research. We only have really, not quite, but close enough, results from survey studies that were conducted online, let's say, but we don't have good studies that look at what happens when these interventions are implemented in real life, as opposed to in fake life or, in surveys and so on. Testing effects, which I will explain in great detail in a second. A reliance on item evaluation tasks, meaning researchers care a lot about certain efficacy measures, but not so much about others. Again, I'll get that in a bit. Low impact and an overestimation of how many people are positively impacted by the interventions that we design. A tremendous problem with a low replicability in the global south, and unintended consequences of our interventions, such as psychological reactance and trust in whoever is implementing these interventions, which may be relevant for the audience as well. So I'll get to each of these 6 different challenges, if you will. You can call them problems as well. And then finally, after that, we will get to Rakoen's proposed set of solutions, or at least how his work has sought to address some of these challenges. So first of all, I want to draw a relevant distinction between effectiveness and efficacy. And they're not the same thing, although they sound like they might be synonymous. But efficacy is basically a proof of concept, pretty much, right? Let's say you find that a particular new type of medication reduces the growth of cancer cells in a petri dish. That would be efficacy. Whereas effectiveness is, it's been implemented in the real world, let's say it's a cancer medicine or medication, and it reduces tumor growth in people with cancer, right? So that distinction is massive. And in the medical sciences, everyone is aware of it, but in the psychological sciences, not so much. So this translation between these two is rarely made and very often assumed. But as it turns out, if you look into the literature on implementation science, as it's called, we find that very often this translation from efficacy to effectiveness is not made at all. Most medications that, or most substances, I suppose, that produce growth in cancer cells in a petri dish do not become medication fit for use for people. The vast majority do not, in fact. So that's something worth bearing in mind in the context of our discussion. So, first of all, I want to talk about what we in psychological science call testing effects. So we had, Rakoen and I, 2 years ago, supervised an undergraduate student who was extremely ambitious and extremely skilled, Georgia Capewell, who wanted to run a study as part of her final year dissertation project to see whether actively rehearsing the relevant lessons from a particular misinformation intervention could increase how long it would remain effective. And so in her case, she wanted to look at a video that we developed. Rakoen and I have worked a lot about this, which is a very short video of about 90 seconds, which explains to people how you can use emotion to mislead people. Rakoen will go into more detail about this. But that's one of the ways in which people are commonly misled, right? By emphasizing the negative emotional dimensions of a particular discussion, you could override kind of a clinical evaluation of the evidence to a certain degree. So the video is about that. We've tested it a dozen different times, and it works really well at improving people's ability to identify misleading content that makes use of this particular persuasion technique. And so Georgia was not really interested in figuring out if the video worked, but rather in figuring out if the testing methods that we use to see if these videos, if the video remains effective over time, could be up for discussion or up for debate. So this is the experimental design that she came up with, right? Where we have 4 different groups. You can see that here: group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4. Right, and for each group, she recruited about 120-ish participants. And each of these people watched 3 videos, one of which in these 2 cases was the, as we call it, the inoculation video, the psychological vaccine, right, about emotional manipulation. And the control groups watched unrelated videos about nothing in particular, meaning nothing related to the thing that we're actually interested in studying. And what we had was a post-test, and this post-test consists of rating a series of social media posts, or evaluating a series of social media posts. I'll get to that, the details in a second, and Rakoen will talk about it as well, but roughly speaking, this is aimed at assessing how good you are at distinguishing misleading content from not misleading content. And that basically means evaluating 12 social media posts, and that gives you a score, right? Which we call the discernment score. So your ability to discern, let's say true from false, misleading from not misleading, etc. And what you hope to see is that the people who are in the treatment group, in the inoculation group, are significantly better at this in a statistical sense than a control group. But what we were also interested in, secondly, is whether that was the case also 48 hours later, not just immediately after watching the video, right? And then thirdly, we wanted to see if doing this test immediately after would help to consolidate what people learned. So here we have this design, right, where one group gets this post-test twice, right? Once immediately after viewing and once 48 hours later. And then the other group also watches the inoculation video, but only gets that post-test after 48 hours, right? Expecting that this group, group 1, would be much better than group 2, even 48 hours later. And then we have the control group, which doesn't get any relevant information, but they do get the same kind of testing, right? To rule out the possibility that maybe it's the repeated testing that causes the effect. Okay, complicated design. So Georgia did very well at making this happen. It was quite well done, and we also turned it into a paper, as you can see here. So if you Google Georgia Capewell, you will find this article, which you can read because it's open access. And this is what we found. So what we found was here, like you can see how the discernment score basically, right? So for all 3 groups, these 3, it's roughly 1.4. Whereas for this one, it is well over 2, right? And what that means is that the group that receives the immediate post-test, so this group, group 1, right, 48 hours after watching the video, was much better than group 2 at correctly identifying content as misleading, which is a big problem because this group differs from this group only in the sense that they were allowed to rehearse what they learned immediately after they watched the video. whereas the group that was not allowed to rehearse what they watched performed exactly the same as the control group after 48 hours. Then in the same study by Georgia, we also looked at why this happened. So this was a study that Rakoen ran, where we wanted to see, okay, is it because people forget what they learned, or is it because they maybe become less motivated to resist misinformation, which again, Rakoen will discuss in more detail. And so here you can see, this is basically a score of how well people remembered the intervention. This was a different intervention. This is a game that we made, which Rakoen will talk about. And this is basically assessing like how many things about the game do you remember after 10 days. And so the higher the score, the better. And you can see here that there is a pretty big difference between this group and this group, in the sense that the group who played the game and then immediately had a post-test had much better memory than the group that did not do the post-test immediately. So what we find here is that when people play a game or watch a video and they don't immediately rehearse what they learned straight after, they forget very quickly what they learned, which means that you can no longer really detect the intervention after a relatively short period of time. In other words, rehearsal is critical, which sounds like a no-brainer to many educational psychologists, for instance, but for us, it wasn't a no-brainer at all. But what's more important is that a lot of the time you can't really ask people to rehearse what they learned. For example, when they watch, a short video about misinformation, they're already invested in watching the video, but can you really convince them to then also practice what they learned? That's really hard to do. So that's something to definitely bear in mind here. About those item evaluation tasks, right? This is roughly what they look like. So here you can see a social media post, right? And it says guns are made for killing, murder, death, end of story, and then some hashtags. We blacked out the source information here and the time and date and so on. We just make sure that people wouldn't use that information to evaluate this. And then we ask them these kinds of questions, right? This post is manipulative, and you can say I strongly disagree or I strongly agree, right? Anywhere from 1 to 7. This post is trustworthy, or I would share this post with people in my network, right? And so that basically gives you a certain score that we then call discernment in the end. And we assume that performance on this task translates to real life, right? Meaning we hope to see that if, because of the intervention, people become better at evaluating this type of content, right, more accurately, that means that they will also do that on social media, let's say, or when they watch the news, or when they read the newspaper, or whenever else, right? Whenever they encounter some kind of information where this type of evaluation ability is relevant. But do we really know if that's the case? The challenge that we've identified in this paper is that we don't really know if that's actually true, partially because the effects might disappear, as I just discussed, but also partially because this is a translation between efficacy and effectiveness that we have never really explicitly tested. So I for sure welcome ideas from people about how to best go about doing these kinds of, or kind of bridging that gap, if you will. But more importantly, perhaps, this is also a consequence of what we're doing when we want to fight misinformation, for example, on social media, right? So, as I mentioned at the beginning, there's not that many field studies that we have available, meaning studies that test the impact of interventions in real life as opposed to in a laboratory. They do exist, but the problem is that a lot of these studies show very, very small effects, or even null effects, which in statistical language means that you find no effect at all. And so that means that what we keep finding is that the impact of these interventions, especially if you only implement them once, is very small or maybe fleeting. And what we try to identify in this paper, or at least try to come up with a reason why that might be the case, is because there might be a small group that potentially benefits from the intervention. And so this is the sort of concentric half circles that we've identified. This may or may not be completely perfect. I don't think so, but it's an idea of what might be going on, right? So here the idea is that these concentric half circles become smaller and smaller as the potential group of people who benefits from the intervention decreases, right? So the largest circle is people who use social media, let's say, right? And let's imagine that this is the potential impact of an intervention that is aimed at reducing the sharing of misinformation with other people, right? So the intervention really for all social is not useful for all social media users, but rather only for those social media users who share unwanted content, let's say misinformation, right? Which is not all of them. But it's also only useful for those people who not only share unwanted content, but also share it accidentally or out of ignorance, meaning they don't deliberately do it, right? Because if they do it deliberately, then the intervention is not going to be very useful for them, because they're going to say like, well, I know that I shouldn't be sharing it, but I don't care. I'm going to do it anyway, right? And of those people, there's another smaller subgroup who are potentially amenable to some kind of intervention, right? So they might be, interested potentially in watching a video, or they might be interested in playing a game or something else, right? Which is not everyone. And of those people, there's a subset of people, a smaller group, that actually see the intervention, right? And then of that group, there's an even smaller group of people who interact with the intervention as intended. They play the whole game, they watch the whole video, let's say, right? And they pay attention and they understand the message and all these kinds of things. And then of that group, the intervention is only really useful for people who encounter unwanted content while the intervention's still working, right? As I showed just now, the intervention is only effective for a limited period of time. So you have to encounter unwanted content that while the intervention still works. And then the group of people for whom the intervention has been effective is that group of people who meet all of these conditions and who are successfully prevented from sharing content with others that we don't want them to share. And so that is a relatively small group. I don't make any claims as to how big this group is supposed to be. That's really hard to determine. But it's certainly much smaller than all social media users, which may potentially explain why we find it so difficult for our interventions to consistently kind of have the effects that we want in real life as opposed to in a laboratory. Now, a few other things that are worth pointing out here. One is this one, the Global South. So psychology and pretty much all of social science has a tremendous bias, if you will, towards doing research in the West, meaning vast majority is North America, United Kingdom quite a lot, Australia quite a lot, Germany quite a lot. And that it really drops off from there. And there are some studies from other places, but there really aren't that many. Which is partially a function of the fact that most money exists in the United States, in academia, and in the UK and in some other places. Which means that we assume a lot of the time that what we've developed in the global north, right, in the West or in democratic countries like the United States and the United Kingdom and other places, will also work elsewhere. But the problem that we keep running into that is just not the case at all. We've done some studies ourselves. So here you can see this one, Parihar, Haryani et al. Under review. This is the result of a long collaboration to test certain interventions around misinformation in India. And we didn't really find anything at all. And that was partially just a function of us not knowing what we were doing. Partially, it was problems with the surveys and the implementations of the studies that we did. There were many reasons, but either way, we just didn't find a whole lot. And we've written it up, we'll publish it. Not the most encouraging thing, I would say, but we learned a lot for sure, and we really enjoyed working on it, but it's just really, really difficult to do this kind of work and develop things that work everywhere as opposed to for only a subset of people. And then finally, there is the underexplored issue of reactance, or the possibility that people may resist interventions or develop skepticism against whoever developed them, right? So the idea is basically that if let's say the Russian government were to say, we are going to inoculate people against misinformation, many of the people in the audience, I'm assuming, will be skeptical towards that because they do not trust the Russian government, which that is fair. I don't think you should trust the Russian government. I don't trust the Russian government myself, and many Russians don't trust the Russian government. So that's probably a good decision. But sometimes, right, that function of trust influencing how likely you are to engage with an intervention also seeps into other debates, right? So this is a study that was done by Alexandra Johnson and Jens Metzen from the London School of Economics that was published this year, where they wanted to see, okay, how likely are you as an individual to watch a particular inoculation video, right, if it was produced by different sources? So here you can see, right, about 4.5 out of 7 if there is no source, you don't tell people about it. About 2 out of 7 if it's the Russian government, right? Very low trust, fair enough. Meta, right? Facebook, basically, medium trust. Harvard, high trust. The Republican Party, kind of partisan trust, right, for the United States. And the Democratic Party, trust left, and so on. So the key takeaway here is that how likely people are to engage with an intervention is in part a function of how much they trust the source. And the most interesting thing here, I think, is even the high trust source, Harvard in this case, does not outperform the no source. So this is about equal. This is about the same number, right? Which means that even the most highly trusted sources are not better than having no source at all, which is very interesting and something worth thinking about, because that impacts how likely we are to have success with the implementation of our interventions. And this is what Alex Johnson and Jens Metzen call inoculation hesitancy, which I thought was a very clever term. Okay, what can we do? There are many things that we identify in this paper, which, by the way, is open access in case anyone wants to have a look. But many of these things Rakoen will discuss himself, sort of his proposed solutions to some of the problems, although not all of the problems that I've identified. But just a very brief summary, sort of what we say in the paper are: 1, co-designing interventions with your target audience will help a lot. Investing in field studies and hard-to-reach sample diversity. Elevate alternative outcome measures. Measure if people actually like your intervention, if they trust you, as opposed to only looking at these item evaluation tasks that I mentioned, and try to incorporate system level and individual level approaches. For instance, we've just published a preprint, which is under review at the moment, where we asked social media users to unfollow certain very polarizing figures in their environment, right? Very strongly political individuals, for instance. And that we found that doing that actually reduced how polarized they felt about their environments, about groups in their surroundings of groups that they liked and didn't like. So that's a positive finding. Should be studied further still, of course, but nonetheless, it's encouraging. So there's this sort of in-between individual level and system level intervention that we can start to explore, which would be extremely interesting. I will end here. I will pass on to Rakoen, but first, finally, I want to mention my collaborators, and this is this whole list. There are many others, but these are just the ones that I managed to include for now. So thank you very much, and I will pass on to Rakoen for the rest of the presentation. Thank you, Rakoen. Oh.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant introduction, and that will nicely fit with my slides. Let's see if I can share them. All right. Okay, that works. I will assume so, unless someone shouts no. Okay, good. I will focus a bit on the specific issue of the long-term effectiveness of inoculation interventions. And but many of the issues that John mentioned, I mean, we have papers on all of these issues, and if you're interested in thinking about solutions for each of those, feel free to have a look at our various publications on these methodological topics. This presentation here now is going to focus just on specifically on the issue of how can we increase the long-term effectiveness of our interventions, because that's an effectiveness here, right? Maybe I have to think a bit more, John, about efficacy and effectiveness. Long-term efficacy, not sure what that would mean. But yeah. All right, so just a quick introduction into inoculation interventions for those that are not familiar with it. If this is a timeline, and in the middle of this timeline you get exposed to misinformation, there are things we can do, there are interventions we can design after exposure, for during exposure, and for pre-exposure. To give you an example, a simple thing after exposure is fact-checking or debunking, trying to undo the damage when the damage is already done. One thing you could do during exposure is, for example, accuracy nudges. That's a typical intervention that's been implemented in various social media platforms, but it started, the first experiment were on Twitter, and the idea basically was that if you are seeing some shady content and you click on share, that it would say, are you sure you want to share this, right? And the idea is that then your attention shifts towards accuracy and so on. Or you can do things before the intervention, before the exposure misinformation, to protect people proactively. And one of those techniques to do that is called inoculation. And inoculation was really designed in the 60s. They used to have these beautiful psychology magazines with these beautiful images. They don't do that anymore, unfortunately. But William Maguire in the 60s, he tested a range of different interventions to figure out how you can inoculate people against propaganda, for example, because during the Cold War, he was quite surprised by how easy it was to convince people with propaganda. And he thought, is our education system not good enough, teaching about the facts about why democracy is good and so on? But then he figured out if people are not familiar with the counter argument and not prepared for it, then they could be swayed by it. So he figured out in a bunch of studies that the most effective method to protect people proactively, at least according to inoculation theory, is to have an intervention that has these two elements. And what are they? So you need to make people aware with an effective forewarning. You have to tell them you are vulnerable. You could be fooled by this misinformation, and don't be fooled by it, right? Because everyone is vulnerable. You could be exposed to it, but don't let yourself be caught. And then the second thing is you need to make people familiar with the actual misinformation. So you need to give them examples, weakened doses, just like in a vaccine, right? So for the cognitive immune system to work, you need to make people familiar with the design of misinformation, with either the arguments or the underlying techniques of manipulation. And then you put that in intervention. That can be all kinds of things. I'll give some examples later. And that would then create these cognitive antibodies, if you will. So that's the whole metaphor, right? Or analogy, as you will. And lead to resistance or persuasion. Okay, cool. So another way to put this, but I'll skip this slide. Okay, we know, so you have to trust me, inoculation theory works, has been researched for over 60 years and it works well. But the question is, how well does it work, right? Efficacy to effectiveness, maybe, we stay John's wording. One of the big questions is, how long do these effects last? And it's been a debate for a long time. And in this meta-analysis in 2010, they proposed maybe it's an inverse U-curve. Somehow people would get better a couple of days after intervention and get worse again. But they also proposed it could be an S-curve. And actually, they didn't really know. And one of the big theories was that it's all about motivation. And the idea was that if you go to an inoculation intervention, through that forewarning message, you have an increased threat and you become motivated to defend yourself, right? So a sense of you go to this intervention, you learn about fake news, and then you see it and you're really motivated to apply your knowledge and fight against it. And then either you can increase this threat with threat booster shots, and then you have a retained inoculation effect, or decreasing motivation over time. And that would then lead this, right? So you're motivated, and at some point you lose motivation. It doesn't work anymore. However, I thought there was not a lot of evidence for this in the literature. I think based on the data, we could say just as well it's about memory, where the inoculation intervention teaches you skills about how to recognize misinformation, how to refute bad arguments. and that decay would then be the forgetting, and you could prevent this by strengthening the memory. So that was the alternative model I proposed. And then the decay curve would look a bit more like this, like an Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And then if you would repeat the intervention, the learning would decay less and less quickly until you have really, really long-term effects, right? So that's the idea that I had. So I did a PhD on this. If you're interested, you can read it. That was my PhD where I did a large part of the work also with John as collaborator. And yeah, so I tested this decay curve and the effect gain of booster shots actually work the way I thought it would. And John and I have been testing all of these things in various different types of interventions, text-based interventions. If you're interested in this, we have a lot of work also on climate change, inoculation. How can we teach people about inoculation against polarized topics, using also consensus messaging nudges and so on. We have gamified interventions, a whole range of them. Yeah, I mean, especially John, he's our master of the games. He developed at least 7 games. I don't know how many. Bad News is one of the best ones. It's one of the longest and our one of the first we developed. We also have shortened booster versions of the game and so on. And then with Google, we've been doing a lot of work on video-based interventions. Can we use YouTube, for example, and the ad space in YouTube to protect people at large? For this presentation, I'm just going to focus on one case study in the gamified intervention specifically. Oh yeah, a big part of the PhD and this work on the different models has been published or is going to be published very soon. We have a paper forthcoming in a good journal, but now it's available as a preprint already. And actually, yeah, let me also already give you the spoilers. It wasn't necessarily the motivation or the memory model. In the end, turned out both motivation and memory important, but memory seems to be much more important in contrast. I'll also give you the results there because I'm going to present in more detail a different study. But so this is the results of a bunch of gamified inoculation interventions, and this is the inoculation effect and the decay of it. Yeah, don't look at it in too much detail, but the idea is that yes, it follows a curve that is a bit like a memory decay curve. This is the control group, is a memory curve, and the boosted group doesn't show as much decay. And this is memory, the memory variable. If we measure people's how much they remember from the interventions, we see that this has a very similar pattern, the memory and the inoculation effect decay, while for motivation there is no change. But we also did notice, and this is maybe something interesting to take into account, is that we didn't manage to boost motivation at all in none of our interventions, the text-based, gamified, and video-based ones. So that's maybe a flaw in our interventions, but these are the big interventions out there now, and none of them seem to drastically increase motivation at the start. So maybe we're not getting the full potential of our interventions, and we have to experiment maybe with increasing motivation. But I don't know. Okay, anyways, across a bunch of studies, so we found evidence for this memory motivation model, but that mainly says memory is the best predictor for the long-term effectiveness of inoculation interventions. And you can boost this long-term effects using memory boosters, so reminders or re-administering of the intervention or the content of it. Threat boosters or motivation boosters didn't seem to work really. Motivation itself did seem to help in general. People who are more motivated are better at detecting misinformation, but the actual intervention effects were mainly driven by memory. Okay, now the study I actually want to present is this one. So we developed a bunch of new games, but one of them is Bad Facts. It's a game about 10 minutes. You learn about 4 manipulation techniques, emotional storytelling, naturalistic fallacies, conspiracy theories, and so on. Yeah, you can play it. You can Google it. Maybe John has a link that he can put in the chat. I don't know. It's a cool game, and we know that it works because we did a couple of studies before, a couple of RCTs, and we knew that it had positive small effects, but there were a whole bunch of problems. So it was the decay over time, but we also saw an increase in general skepticism towards all news. That's the side effects, the potential negative side effects that John also mentioned. So lack of long-term effects and potential side effects, the general skepticism, which could be good or bad depending on your philosophy, right? Okay, but based on these studies' data, we developed a new and improved version of the game, BadVax 2.0, that includes a feedback module. So that's one of our papers. We look at the effects of feedback. You can also find that paper online. But basically what it does is, in the game, you get asked to categorize a headline in misleading, not misleading, and then you get immediate feedback. This is correct, this is wrong, and why it's correct or why it's wrong, and so on. And this is this helps as some kind of calibration exercise. It helps you to improve your general calibration so that you're not overly skeptical. Okay, so this is now the study I want to show in the last 7 minutes I have left. We ran this new massive study. I tested out a new design that tries to take into account as many of those problems that John mentioned. So we had a large sample of 3,800 participants in the US. It was census-based quota for age and gender. It was also balanced on ideology is also a problem. Many studies are just with liberals. We had 30 time points, and individuals were allocated 1 of 30 time points. There was no repeated testing. Everyone had only one post-test, so no testing effects that John mentioned, no learning confounds. And we also looked at how the effects of the intervention can spread beyond an individual. So this is also maybe in the sense of effectiveness, right? So how much, if you roll this out, could spill over to other individuals for the positive effect. So simply said, the intervention, we put people either in the Tetris group, and yes, people seem to have enjoyed playing Tetris, they said in the comments, and then or the VADFAX group. So good. Then they were also, okay, maybe one more thing. So if you were in the Tetris group, there were actually 3 control groups. Just a normal control group, and I'll repeat this a couple times, it's quite a complicated design. There was a control group that also received a diffusion message. Okay, so what is diffusion message? Okay, pay good attention. People who had the BadVax intervention, the inoculation intervention, they were asked to write a message to people in the control group to teach them about what they learned in the game. So that's the diffusion message, right? So people who played BadVax wrote a message to this group. And so this second group, they got a first degree diffusion message. Now, we also tested second degree diffusion. And these were messages generated by people who received this first degree diffusion message. So basically this group wrote message for this group, right? So there's this, so the first degree diffusion is from this group writing a message to this group, and then this group to this group, second degree. Okay, there was another condition, complicated study, that played BadVax twice, basically. So that was inoculation plus booster group. Voila, 5 groups. Okay, every participant did 1 post-test, and they were allocated to a random date, either immediately after the tests, 1 day later, 2 days later, all the way up to 30 days later. Okay, it's actually 31 time points, now that I think of it, right? Yeah. Okay, so everyone had to judge 12 misleading or manipulative posts and 12 neutral posts. So they had to rate, is this post manipulative? How confident am I? Would I share this? And so on. And there were pairs basically on similar type of text, but one is manipulative or one is non-manipulative. Okay, cool. So the 4 key questions is, does this work now? And is it better? How long does it work? When do we need to administer a booster? Does a booster work at all? We kind of expect it to work based on the previous studies. And does the effect diffuse beyond the normal participants? Okay, good. I hope you're all still following. So this is just, the same thing. Just to give you an idea, so the diffusion message, we asked them this: please write a short essay below with examples of what you would say to protect others against misleading online information based on your knowledge. And people actually generated some good messages. If you look at it, for example, this is a participant-generated messages. They use phony names such as doctoral scientists and write quotes from them that they never said, or change words and so on. So yeah, there's some good stuff out there. Okay, right. So basic effects. Yes, it works. We give an improvement in the manipulative discernment and sharing discernment. So it means, well, very concretely, can show you here. People judge manipulative posts as more manipulative, so more manipulative, And people judge neutral posts as less manipulative after the intervention. So good effects, so both the general discernment and specifically manipulative and neutral. So this means that the added feedback module, so from our methodological studies, we know that feedback works, and exactly that's what we find here. We managed to calibrate the judgments, both neutral and manipulative detection improves. There's no general skepticism. Okay, now how long does it last? Well, we see that basically the effect remains quite significant about 2 weeks after the intervention. That's actually better than we expected. Maybe the feedback exercise has boosted them because there was no post-test in between, right? So both the inoculation intervention and the booster intervention conditions showed significant and good effects. Okay, and then if we look at beyond 2 weeks, we see that the effect completely evaporates unless you are boosted. And the booster then after that, if you look at the curve, decays less quickly as you would expect from a memory decay curve. So booster intervention seemed to work. Good. However, what didn't work is the diffusion interventions. So it already didn't work at 2 weeks. So D1 is the diffusion intervention, no effect. So those messages that were written, didn't really seem to work. I mean, they seem to be descriptive something, but it's not significant. So maybe a smaller effect that we can't measure. And yeah, second degree diffusion definitely didn't work, but that wasn't to be expected. Right. We do see, if we look at the content analysis of these diffusion messages and the first degree diffusion, people do write about some of the things they learn in the game. So it seems like they did learn something and they do manage to communicate about it. It was just not good enough to have second degree effect. Okay, so this is kind of the decay curve again. Yeah, most of the decay seems to happen in those first 2 weeks. So between this period of 3 to 15 days, and then it's completely gone, the effect. But the booster works well and then decays less quickly, right? Okay, so the booster was presented like here, right? So it's like, it should be more like here, but no, it's more like the original effect size. Cool. Right, so in summary, baseline effects, so robust small to medium effects of intervention. Now with this new feedback module, we see that both better fake news and real news detection and sharing discernment all improved. But the effect almost completely decays within 2 weeks. But the booster sessions can prolong it and decrease the speed of decay. Right, so the diffusion messages, first degree, descriptive improvement, but not significant, maybe small effect, but definitely not beyond first degree. Voila, so we know our answers. Does it work? Yes, 2 weeks, slower decay after booster, and yeah, voila. Right, that's about it.
That was fantastic. I'm so pleased to have had a chance to hear this again and elaborate on it more following the talk at Imbes, which was just so fantastic. So we have got some specific questions in the chat from Kathy and Chloe, which even though John has sort of addressed them in the chat, I think it is worth asking out loud and seeing, maybe Rakoen, you have some additional thoughts. So Chloe initially asked, how do one's political beliefs interact with specific content? So if I were a Trump supporter, I might be more likely to identify misinformation, about guns and murder, but I might be less likely to identify misinformation or manipulation about climate change. Do you have any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
John already responded to this in the chat.
Yeah, he did. He did.
I was
But
typing
I
away.
wanted to give a chance to
Okay,
if
no,
you
sounds
wanted to
good.
add
Sounds good.
anything.
I haven't even read John's message. Maybe we're going to say the same in parallel. But yeah, I think there are two things. So one is the content, and the other one is the sources, right? Also, as John mentioned in his presentation, yeah. I mean, people will always scrutinize content that is not in line with their political vision more in a negative way, right? It's motivated reasoning, and this happens in both sides, and I mean, and in equal ways almost, right? So this is just human nature to analyze evidence so that it suits your worldview. I mean, there's a lot of debate on whether people on the left or on the right believe more misinformation. I mean, there are kind of two camps. Some that say it's balanced, Some say that the rights are less good at detecting. I don't think it's that important. What's more important, I think, is that our interventions work across ideological spectrums. And in general, we see that at least for inoculation interventions, it typically works across the political spectrum, not always with the same effect sizes, but generally it works. So we also try to have, it doesn't always work, but have some kind of different routes you can take in our intervention. For example, in our game, sometimes you can choose different routes that you attack either the government or private companies or whatever. So you can also carve your path so that it's more in line with your political vision, and nevertheless, you get a range of examples. So we try to do that, adapt a little bit, and it's always better if you adapt it towards the person's vision, right? So yeah.
Thank you. I hope
Yeah.
that makes it. Yeah, Chloe's got a thumb up, so that's good. I'll also put Kathy's question to you. It's sort of related in a way. It says, how generalizable are the inoculations? So if you're inoculated against bad info on climate change, does it protect against bad info on, for example, AI? To use your analogy, inoculating against smallpox doesn't help mumps.
Yeah, so I mean, there are very mixed findings there, but in general, what we see is that, okay, if you have an intervention, there are different levels of inoculation interventions, right? So there are some that are extremely specific. For example, the climate change intervention that I referred to in my slides, that was one that tackled a very specific form of climate change misinformation, a very specific fake petition. While you could expect maybe a little bit of effects also on other fake petitions because they are aware of how fake petitions work, it is likely to be very limited. But then if you look at the bad news game, for example, we zoom much more out, and the intervention focuses on general techniques and general types of language that are being used in a wide range of misinformation. And the intervention itself has also training examples of different topics. Right, so this is a way to increase the breadth of your intervention effects is by, if you give your weakened dose of misinformation, you can give some examples also outside of that specific topic that use the same technique of manipulation, and that's actually beneficial for everything. Basically, it doesn't harm the topic specific one, and it gives some extra examples. So that's something I could recommend.
That's great, thank you. It kind of links to a question that I had. So I was thinking about John's slide about the successfully treated individuals being a very small group in the big picture of things, and obviously it's probably going to be people who, you know, are better able in some way to interact with this kind of intervention. I was thinking about how, you know, Trump supporters, for example, you know, I've seen a lot of this in videos where people are interviewing them, and because their attitude towards Trump is so positive, you know, they're so positively primed towards him that they seem to really struggle to assimilate information that's not consistent with that view. And of course, they're very quick to assimilate information that is consistent with that view. So, you know, seeing as the implications are, it must be quite hard to target that particular group. Is it all about sort of getting in before those views are fixed and trying to sort it? Or, you know, is there a role for, you know, getting in there afterwards?
Is it okay if I help?
Yeah, go for it, John. Yeah.
Yeah, so what you're describing is a well-known theory in this domain called motivated reasoning, right? The idea that identity-based, if you will, motivations override assessments, sort of a cold calculated assessment of the evidence. And that happens to all of us. It just becomes worse the stronger your sense of identification is with a particular identity, right? Be it political or otherwise. And that's a known finding, right? And so one thing that we're not able to make our way around, both at the theoretical level and at the practical level, is everything we do as psychologists relies on people voluntarily deciding to take part in our interventions, right? There is no way around that. So that's the first barrier that you have to meet. If someone says, well, this was made by some egghead at a British university, I don't care, right? I'm not gonna, this isn't for me, leave me alone. There is nothing we can do, right? the only thing we can really do is make interventions as fun and attractive as possible, work with people who they're for, improve things, talk to people, and all these kinds of things. There's no, like, you cannot rely on any kind of coercion whatsoever. It just doesn't really work that way. So you're forced to kind of rely on voluntary persuasion, which you can be better at or worse at, but you're never going to reach everyone that you want to reach. And that's okay. We don't have that goal.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think also, I mean, I presented on inoculation and so on, but as John, I'm more on the side of what John said on you have the individual level and system level interventions, and we need a whole range of things. And inoculation itself might not be appropriate for extremely polarized conspiracy groups that you can't get into when it's already too late, right? And indeed, inoculation was kind of designed to be there ahead of that, so proactive kind of interventions to make sure people don't end up in these groups. But then there's much more at play than just knowledge and beliefs, right? So what I find interesting in this whole research area, one of the most surprising things I found over the years is that actually the beliefs and the sharing and the behaviors, they're not that clearly linked together, right? People do all kind of things because it has benefits to belong to a social group. It has benefits to be part of your local community. And if you live in an area where there are Trump supporters, for example, then you want to fit in, right? So you can't, so there's also that physical location. And then on top of that, one of the most interesting things I found together with John also in a couple of studies is that one of the best predictors actually for being resilient to misinformation is something called actively open-minded thinking, which is actually, so it's a good thing to be open-minded, and actively open-minded thinking is about being able to adapt your worldviews to new information, new data, to be willing to listen to others, you know, being humble about your own intellectual capacities and actually really updating the way you look at things. You see people often who get extremely polarized or extremely conspiratorial, they can't update their beliefs anymore. It's stuck, right? So, and if you find ways to boost that open-minded thinking, that could be a way in if you're already that far at a stage. But that's a whole new area that we're still discovering. How can we actually boost that? And then a final small thing is then I think a lot about it is about trust. If you really trust someone, you want to listen to someone as well. So sometimes I think it's better to, instead of fighting someone with arguments, is to become good friends with that person. And then at some point, that person might start listening to what your opinion is. And that way you might convince them. So it might be a different approach than the more attacking approach. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I actually do have one more question, which I think would wrap this all up if you're able to stay a couple more minutes. Is that okay? Or do you have to head off?
That's fine. A few more minutes.
You're okay? Oh, brilliant. Thank you. It kind of links to what Chloe is saying in the chat about we need better education on critical thinking, etc. Because when we met at Imbes, you know, I hope it's not unfair to say that you expressed your surprise to be sort of presenting at an educational conference, but you know what strikes me over and over again is how relevant this topic is for education. You know, it links to all these processes of learning, the kinds of information you integrate, your reasoning skills, fast and slow thinking, and as you said, rehearsal and consolidation and that kind of thing. So I guess my big roundup question is, do you have any messages for educators specifically on what they can do to help their students, you know, reduce their susceptibility to misinformation?
So there are a lot of tools available that have been evidence tested, such as the Stanford Civic Online Reasoning Curriculum, freely available online. Everyone can use it. It's in American English, which is a bit unfortunate, I suppose. But other than that, it's not bad at all. There are the games that we've used, which some of our colleagues have used in classrooms to some success, right? Because the students are engaged in it and then you can have a discussion afterwards. But also other things that help are kind of talking with students about what they are seeing, right? And what they think is and isn't misinformation. And learn from that, because it's also true that, at least in my case, I don't have a very good view of how students under 18, say, consume information. It changes all the time, and I'm getting older and older, and it keeps getting more and more confusing. So there's also a lot for me to learn from them, right? And then help contextualize what they might be seeing in a classroom discussion and so on. So those are, yeah, there's different ways to go about it. I don't want to be prescriptive sort of about what we've done and that is what others should be doing as well. Certainly not.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
I think everything that John says is perfectly spot on. And then I would add that, yeah, make sure it's fun and collaborative and in positive spirits rather than I had once like critical thinking lessons in high school, I remember. And it was basically all about like laughing about people's mistakes. So that's not the way to go, I think. It's actually about, okay, how can we work together to work to a joint information ecosystem, ecospace, like whatever, information space, where you have fun in the act of inquiry, right? So and work together with others, not creating people's own truth. I guess that's an important thing to protect ourselves against. Yeah.
Lovely. I think that is such a fantastic positive message to finish on. So thank you so much again, John and Rakoen. Really, really appreciate you coordinating and coming to speak for us. So thank you all so much, and see most of you next week for our next CEN seminar.